Hello. So I hope to keep this presentation as brief as possible. Now, Mrs. Adams actually made this one. I'm just recording the lecture for it, so it's going to be a little more detailed, which is good. But at the same time, it might be a little longer, so I'm going to try to go fast. Okay. All right. So we've looked at Russia, Britain. Now we're looking at France, another world power, especially at this time. And we're going to look at the revolution plus their democracy that was formed. So Napoleon III, he was a nephew to the Napoleon that you know of, the first emperor of France. But this guy, yeah, like I said, he's a nephew. He was elected as president in 1848, but then later became his own emperor. He became an authoritarian just like his uncle did. So at first, Napoleon is viewed as this very capable leader. He's strongly supported by the bourgeoisie. That's the middle class. You've heard this a few times, I think, now. They thought he could restore order, and this lower class supported him because they thought he would be able to help. Having that name Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte's the family name. Napoleon is just the first name. It was very nationalistic, and they thought, this was helpful to him. All right. So he established the Second Empire, and it continued to be a constitutional monarchy. So a monarchy governed according to the Constitution that limits and defines the power of those who are sovereigns. So those people that are the king and queens. However, he ruled it like a dictatorship. Okay, he appointed his own cabinet officials. He managed elections, kind of like how Putin manages elections right now too, to make sure his supporters would win. Okay, he put strict censorship on newspapers and limited political debate. Okay, so obviously from a governing and human rights, I guess you'd say, not human rights, but individual rights, he's restrictive in that way, but not always bad though. There's universal male suffrage. Okay, like the other countries didn't have it this early, but again, this is male suffrage, not female. So all males could vote, and they elect to elected assemblies. So Napoleon III was very much in control of the government, though. Still, so in the 1860s, he did begin to lessen his control, particularly regarding censorship and his legislative powers. There was economic growth during this time, like many countries. France prospered in the mid-century. They were pretty early to industrialize, so they improved their infrastructure. Railroads were built. Urban renewal occurred in Paris as well. So we're going to see that domestically, Napoleon was pretty successful overall. However, not so much internationally. But before we get to that, it's important to note that France built the Suez Canal during his rule. And it was 120 miles long. I got this link to more pictures. I think I have time to show you. But essentially, they used like these steam barge dredging machines to dig out those areas. But it significantly shortened the trip from places in Europe all the way to the spice trade and China and Japan, all those other areas that were so lucrative to trade with. But the French did it. They weren't the first to actually try, though. It goes back to all the way to ancient Egypt that they tried to do this. But France was the first to be successful at it, much earlier than the Panama Canal. Also, workers were able to enjoy some of the benefits of economic growth in the country. Their labor unions legalized. Public education was expanded to include females. A small public health program was even created. This is the 1800s. Wow. Despite some improvements, though, to society, many still lived in poverty. We kind of see these happening in other countries at this time as well. Foreign, though, not so great. Okay, not so great at foreign relations. So, for example, in 1860s, he attempted to turn Mexico into a French satellite. Putting someone in power there. It was an Austrian Habsburg prince named Maximilian on the throne. But after the Civil War in America was over, the U.S. really protested this. They didn't want French influence there. And the Mexicans fiercely resisted this as well. So even though this Maximilian was overthrown and killed, though, only after 4 years. So that didn't work out so good for the French. All right. Also, he attempted to add territory to France. So when France and Britain won the Crimean War, remember that's kind of like that was against Russia. France only gained a small foothold in the Middle East, and it was very expensive when it comes to treasure and blood. So not so successful there. I mean, they won, but they didn't get much out of it. And then tensions were also growing with Prussia. Remember Bismarck, right? Otto von Bismarck and William I as well. So Prussia wanted a German prince on the throne in Spain, right? But this concerned France, Napoleon. So France convinced Prussia not to do this, but tensions between the two escalated. Remember the Bismarck letter, right? Even though the demands by the French were released. So if you remember though, Bismarck wanted France to attack them so he could unite all of these German states, these southern German states, with Prussia, because then it was going to be much stronger than France. So the Prussians destroy France at the Battle of Sedan, September 1st, and Wilhelm, by the January 18th, he was crowned the Emperor of Germany, all right, in France. So yeah, France kind of took the debate on this one. And so with the defeat of Napoleon III, right, they capture him, right? The Second Republic is declared over, and the Third Republic begins, all right? So they also lose this area of France as well to Prussia. So in 1871, the National Assembly accepts the peace treaty with Germany, and they give up this Lorraine, Alsace, something, and pay a large reparation to Germany, and this takes them years to pay off as well. So in response to the treaty, the Paris Commune, this is a group of rebels or communards, they desire a new socialist order, and that forms. So the Paris Commune is ordered to disband those, so troops are sent in to retake the city, and this starts basically a civil war that rages for weeks, ending in the death of 20,000 rebels. So this suppresses this fight against this new government, but it deepens these social divides in France. So we're going to see this tension rise in France. All right. So this Third Republic was set up to be temporary, but ended up lasting 70 years. So it was a bicameral. I mean, there's two House legislatures, like we have the Senate and we have the House. It made up a Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. So there's wide divisions between classes and priorities. So they had to develop these coalitions, and this is an alliance between parties that develops. So let's say there's 5 political parties that get together. That's a coalition. All right, it's when you get these different groups that come together to to get something done, but also to put whoever is in charge. Okay, so like they have to get together, and that's the government that's in place. But like, let's say there's 4 groups here and 5 groups here. If one of those group members leaves and joins this other coalition, then their government gets to be in charge. Okay, so this resulted in a lot of instability. They get dozens of different coalitions over 10 years. All right, so like in our country, we'll have Republicans, Democrats in power for 2, 4, or 6 years at a time, and they have it like a couple weeks, and then like one group defects and it doesn't work. Okay, so a lot of instability because of it. So while France during this time, though, France did still make economic progress. It had to pay the Germany their debt though, but they were expanding their overseas empire, which is profitable still. All right, they were only second to Britain when it came to their colonies and their imperialism. But they had a series of scandals from 1880 to 1890 that severely weakens the people's trust in the government, and you want people to have trust in your government if you want to stay in power. And the prime example of this is the Dreyfus Affair. So Alfred Dreyfus, he's a high-ranking military officer. I believe he was in the artillery, and they accuse him of spying for Germany, sending plans of guns or artillery equipment to Germany. And Dreyfus was the first Jewish person to rise that high in the army ranks, and he was hated for it. Okay, so again, this anti-Semitism is not just in Russia, it's also here in France and many other places as well. And they found him guilty of treason and sentenced to life. Okay, but it was an accusation that ended up not being true. So the country is divided over this. New evidence is uncovered 2 years later that's showing Dreyfus is innocent, but the army refuses to grant him this new trial. So he's over on an island by South America at the time. Émile Zola, a French novelist, published this article, the J'accuse, in support of his exoneration. Of Dreyfus is accusing the army and the government of suppressing the truth. And so Zola is charged for libel, the one that's basically pointing out that, hey, the government and military is doing this to him. He didn't. He's innocent. So Zola is charged for libel, knowingly publicizing damaging or false statements, and flees into exile. So the author runs away, but eventually Dreyfus supporters are able to prove that evidence used against Dreyfus was forged, and he was cleared of all charges, and his military honors are restored. And then actually he even fights in the next war, in fact. But this brings to light, it just really put a light on like how anti-Semitic people were in France at this time. So again, anti-Semitism is the hostility or prejudice against Jewish people. And this is rising throughout Europe, including Russia as well. So while some Jews have been able to find success as a result of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, most still lived in poverty. So again, France, they were the most liberal at the time. They really wanted freedom of religion and things like that. So Jewish people did all right in France. But again, they still lived in poverty. There's still a lot of, prejudice against them. All right, and so the Dreyfus Affair, this is also points to this push called Zionism. So Theodor Herzl, a Hungarian Jewish journalist living in France at the time, helped to launch modern Zionism. Okay, and this is still a thing today. A movement devoted to rebuilding a Jewish state in Palestine. So that's where Israel comes from, or not Israel, where it comes from. Israel's been around for a long time, but Jewish people now are the main inhabitants of Israel. Okay, and this is kind of where it starts. So just want to quickly point out, Jewish population today, just there are more Jewish people in America than any other country. But most of them are not the core, like traditional Jewish people like you would see in Israel. But just want to show that there is, when it comes to like serious practicing Jewish people, they're, it's pretty much America and Israel. That's the vast majority of them. Like 80% of Jews live in America or Israel. So just want to point that out. All right. So the Zionism, by the way, continues and is still a thing now. Now, when people talk about Zionism, it's really protecting the state of Israel, at least the Jewish leadership and people there. Okay. French reforms. All right. So despite the challenges in France, it did achieve some reforms in the early part of the 20th century. So hours and wages regulated for workers and working conditions improved. We saw this in other countries. Public elementary schools are established, which reduce the religious power of the Roman Catholic Church. So like education was just kind of taken care of by the church, paid by the state or the church, but it was kind of regulated and controlled and, whatnot. It was the Roman Catholic Church, and they took that away from them. So in 1905, laws were passed to separate the church and state. So Jews, Catholics, Protestants, they were all free to worship as they choose. And none would receive special treatment from the government. Okay, so even though the vast majority of people there at the time were Catholic and still today, not necessarily practicing, but claim to be Catholic. All right, and then the French Reforms. This is the one that was super lagging compared to other countries. So in 1890, women's rights movement was growing in numbers, but by 1896, married women were granted the right to their own earnings, but they would not get the right to vote until after World War II. That's a long time. It was not that long in most other European countries. So at least not Britain or even Russia. But yeah, that's crazy, right? So by 1914, France was the largest democratic country in Europe with basic human rights guaranteed by the Constitution, and France's economy was prosperous, and its overseas holdings ranked second in the world behind Britain. Again, they were the largest imperialist country at the time other than Britain. However, due to the political instability, the threat of Germany, the desire to revenge defeat the Franco-Prussian War, France was in a precarious position, and Europe was heading into World War at this point. So this is kind of our road to World War I. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that. I guess it was a lot to write. Hopefully you didn't write everything, but there's a lot here. All right, please study and take these notes and use them on the quiz tomorrow. Good luck.